wing what I'm going to try to remember some of the beautiful things that were added to this. But here we are in the second Mishnah, in the second parak, in the second chapter, the second Mishnah of the second chapter, and we are with Rabban Gamliel, who was the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who we called Rebbe. He was the rabbi of Judaism. He literally ensured that Judaism would be transmitted through the ages. One of the many things he did is he codified the Mishnah, which means he took it from an oral transmission, just from one sage to another sage, and he codified it in writing. So these were the great, great rabbis, and these are their maxims. These are their most kind of the lessons for life that are most critical for them to pass on. And so I'm going to read it in Hebrew, like I always do, so that we can really, even if you don't understand it, you can just hear it in its original language. Here we go. Okay. Mishnah 2. Rabban Gamliel Bano, Rabbi Gamliel, his son, Bano, Shel Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, Yafe Talmud Torah, Im Derech Eretz. It's good to combine Torah study with an occupation. She'agit shnehem shgachat avon. For the effort involved in both of them makes one forget sin. B'kol Torah she'ein ima malacha, sofa b'telu goreret avon. For Torah study, it's just studying all the time without a worldly occupation, without doing, without being actively involved in a trade or in work, will in the end fail, and it will lead to sin. V'chol ha'oskim im hatzibur, sheschut avosam l'seyatam. For all who work for the community should do so for the sake of heaven. If you work for the Jewish people, you have to do it for the right reasons. V'tzidkascha omeret la'ad. For their righteousness endures forever. And as for you, God will say, I count you worthy of great reward, as though you yourselves had accomplished it all. Okay, so the first thing that we want to tackle is the concept of priorities in Jewish history. What were the critical priorities? I've given this story so many times, but I'll never stop loving it, which is I think it's the great Stephen Covey story where he of the big rocks. He asks, I don't know if you ever, some of you might not have heard me say this story, but I said it so many times, but it's such a beautiful reminder of how to live, which is figure out what your greatest priorities are and make sure those are in your life first, and then everything else can find their place. And the story of the rocks is that a teacher once filled a jar with many, 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 many pebbles rising all the way up to the top. And she asked the students, is this jar full? And the students said, definitely, there's no more room in the jar for anything. And then she took tiny, tiny little pebbles, tiny, tiny little ones, and filled it even more. Is this jar full? Absolutely, it's filled to the top. At which point she then poured in sand, which was able to fill the jar even more. Is it now full? Yes. It's filled to the top. At which point she poured in water and she said, is there still room for more? Yes, it's filled to the top. And then she takes big rocks and she says, are there room for these rocks? And the answer is no, there is no room for the rocks. And the message really in its inverse is when you put the big rocks in first, then there's room for more. You can put the sand in, you can put the little rocks in. There's room for more once the big rocks are in the jar. And so from a Jewish perspective, I think what Rabban Gamliel is asking is, what are the big rocks? What are some of the big rocks that a Jew needs to live with? So the first thing that he says is good is Torah study together with, okay, I'm gonna read it half in Hebrew, half in English, because Derech Eretz is translated in different ways. But he says, good is Torah study. It is good, yafeh, to combine Torah study with Derech Eretz. Okay, Derech Eretz can be translated in a bunch of ways, but for the sake of this class, we're going to translate it in as worldly occupation. So basically what he's saying is a person can't do one and not the other. A person has to study and learn and live for Torah, and they must be involved in some sort of occupation, some sort of worldly trade. Now, it's a given. In our day, we would say, make sure that, the worldly occupation is a non-negotiable, but make sure you try to learn a little Torah study on the side. But from his perspective, it was a total given that you learn Torah. So now we live in a world where work is king, and Torah study hopefully will be fit in little bits. But in his day, it was unequivocal and absolute and non-negotiable that Jews learned Torah. Jews transmitted Torah from one generation to the next. And he says, make sure you don't just study. Make sure you have a worldly occupation. And all the great sages of the Talmud were also shoemakers. They were cobblers. They were ironsmiths. They were woodsmiths. All the great sages had an occupation. And then he says something very interesting, very interesting. For if you work in both, if you really work, if you exert yourself in Torah, by the way, he doesn't just say if you're like a dilettante in both. He's saying if you truly give both of them your all, you will mishkacha avon, you'll forget sin. This is really interesting. And what we're going to discover is when we don't have enough going on in our lives, when we are bored, when we have like too much time to kill, when we have like an empty place inside of us, it often gets filled with things like thoughts and feelings and even physical sensations that we don't like, because we're meant to be truly living full lives, both physically and mentally. That does not mean work harder, push harder. A lot of people think the route to success is just working harder, do more and work harder and be busier. It's like there's almost like a status with being busy. Like I'm so busy all the time, but that's not what it's saying. But what it is saying is when there's too much downtime, when you're not busy in a healthy sense with meaningful things, then nature abhors a vacuum. And in that place, depression will come, anxiety will come, a sense of listlessness will come. And what's really interesting is that psychologists understood that. The great concept of the hierarchy of needs, where Abraham Maslow talks about when people are involved in survival, that's all they're involved in. When they're involved with getting their basic needs met, shelter, safety, food, water, security, that's all they can focus on. But when those needs are met, Dr. Maslow says the human being just moves to a more nuanced need, a need for meaning or a need for actualization. It does not mean that when the basics are met, the human being is fine. And that's interesting because anyone who's in a survival mode, anyone in Ukraine right now, or even our great grandparents would say, we were so focused on survival. And we thought, well, if those survival needs were met, if I had enough money, if I had a car in the garage, if I had security, and if I had, the basics met, then I'd be fine. I'd be absolutely fine. But what we've come to understand, particularly in our generation, is that when all those needs are met, the need just goes to another level, more psychological. And that's why a lot of times when people don't have a sense of purpose in their life and they're not busy enough, this has probably happened to you in your life, where things are too quiet and things like you don't necessarily feel you're contributing enough, or there's something missing. That's where depression slips in. That's where kind of more physical symptoms slip in. This idea that we have a need to contribute on a very profound level, and it rises to the top even more acutely when our other needs are met. So, and that was the point of Abraham Maslow's great study about the hierarchy of needs. The human being wants to contribute creatively, contributively. They want to make a difference in the world. When they're focused on their imminent survival, that's all they're going to focus on. But when those needs are met, they're going to need something more deeply. So Rabban Gamliel comes around and says, if you really are involved in both, you'll almost like stay out of trouble. You'll stay out of psychological trouble. You'll stay out of trouble. But it really also brings up an interesting question. Good is Torah study together with a worldly occupation, for the exertion in both makes one forget sin. So we have two things here. We have spirituality, interest, Torah learning, involvement with Torah, and then we have worldly occupation. Torah or a job, to learn or to do. Are we meant to be in like knee deep in learning all the time? Are we meant to be involved in tikkun olam and doing and working and giving back and tzedakah? Which one is it? And the answer is there is a symbiosis, and ultimately they're both ways of connecting to and serving Hashem. And that really is the idea in Judaism, that there really isn't a difference, that when we infuse all the physical things we do, the consciousness of God, you want me to be in the world. You know, even when we make Kiddush, we say, Sheshis yame tase melachtecha, uv'yom hashvi l'Hashem Elokecha. That means for 6 days we should work. That's huge. What that's basically saying is 6 days we should work, but it doesn't mean 6 days we should be tuned out from godliness. 6 days we're on God vacation, but Shabbat's God time. What it means is for six days, Sheshis yamim tase melachtecha. For 6 days, you want us involved in the world, changing it, actively putting our imprint on the world through either paid work or through voluntary work. I just want to say it's unbelievable here in Jerusalem how much volunteering there is. I mean, everywhere you go, you see people doing unbelievable volunteering. It's remarkable. Where David works once a week or twice a week at Yad Sarah, which is a medical lending empire. They lend all sorts of medical equipment. There are 150 paid employees. There are 7,000 volunteers. 7,000 volunteers. It's this concept of you want me actively making my imprint in the world. And then the seventh day is L'Hashem Elokecha, is the day that I stop creating. And I really tune into the fact that, God, you created me. And this is the day where I'm really, 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 truly am not the creator. I'm the created. And it's really my day of relating to my creator. But the idea that the physical and the spiritual are two separate worlds, that it's not holy to make money, or it's not holy to be sexually involved, or it's not holy to drink, or it's not holy to do anything, that is not Judaism. That is the idea that they're both infused. And that really is the message of the tefillin. The tefillin that men put on every morning is a reminder that you have the hand, you put the tefillin on the arm representing doing, and you have the tefillin on the head representing learning. But what's really interesting is that a man is obligated to put on the tefillin shel yad, the arm tefillin on first, and then the head tefillin. And then when he's taking off his tefillin, he takes the arm off first, and then he takes the head off first, a second. Meaning to say that the head tefillin, representing learning, should never be alone. It should never be separate from or on its own without the doing tefillin, because the doing tefillin reminds us that there's no such thing as learning just to and leaving it there. That ultimately everything we do is to make an imprint on the world. And what really is just incredible is that we know this in our own life. We don't really need to study it in Avos. We if you trace back kind of the source of a lot of like your listlessness or anxiety or anything, for a lot of people, it really is, there's something else I need to do in this life. There's something else I want to contribute in this life. So comes Rabban Gamliel way before Abraham Maslow, thousands of years before him. And he says, you got to do both, because we can put, instead of sin, there is a concept of sin. Sin, avon, might mean when you're super busy with Torah study and working, you don't even have time to get involved in all sorts of temptations. So on the simplest level, it really just means be so busy, but not that not that yucky busy where people use busy as a status symbol, but really be truly osek, be really involved. The word that they use is shiagiat shnehem, like, so really toiling in both of them. You'll be so busy, you won't have time, so to speak, to sin. But I think on a deeper level, what it means is when you combine spiritual pursuit of understanding God through the Torah that he gave you with actively making a difference in the world and serving God through the physical world, through working, through doing, you will be internally fulfilled to the point where all the things that take you from healthiness and happiness can't creep in. It's the good life, and it doesn't mean you have to work full-time or part-time even for pay, but the idea that you're meaningfully engaged in various pursuits, it is huge. And honestly, when you think about it, it really makes sense. We're commanded to work 6 days. You should do your work, but on an even deeper level, we're created in the image of God. So just like God is a creator, when God invests us with a neshama, when he blows into us a chelek, a part of himself, into us in the form of our soul, we have the ability to be like God. And when we're not like God, we feel depressed. When we're not giving back, when we're not nurturing other people, when we're not making a difference, we feel the lack. There's no question about it. So when the human being who is created in the image of God, just like God is a creator, so too she is a creator. He can be a creator. And when she's not, she'll feel the lack. You'll feel the lack. You'll feel a sense of listlessness, even depression. Sometimes some of the physical symptoms, I said that many times, but I think I'm not saying all physical symptoms have a psychological root, but absolutely not. Many of them are very real, but they're all real. But the mind-body connection cannot be denied. It doesn't mean that it's not real, chas v'shalom, God forbid. But what it does mean is there's no question, there's a deep connection between mind and body. So here we go, that when the body's involved in meaningful pursuit, the soul feels fulfilled, because bottom line, we're created in the image of God. Just like God is a creator, so too we're a creator. And when we don't tap into creativity in all different forms, or in our own unique forms of creativity, for some people it's intellectual, for some people it's social, for some people it's artistic, for some people it's literary, for some people it's in the form of giving anything. But when we don't exercise it, we feel the lack. And I do want to say that feeling the lack, the depression, the sadness, the listlessness, the anxiety, there is a very important component to those things that Rabbi Santorsky talks about this a lot, that feelings our feelings are a barometer for if we're on track, if our thinking is on track. So if we're feeling the listlessness, if we're feeling low energy, if we're feeling those feelings, a kind of exciting way of relating to those feelings is curiosity. What may I not be tapping into that would fill me up, that would make me so to speak, shokach avot, forget sin. Not that, God forbid, not that depression is sin, but the point is here, this is something that Rebbe Santorsky talks about all the time. When she was here in Jerusalem, I hosted her on Sunday nights, and she talked about this a lot, that your feelings are a barometer for if you're on track, if your thinking is on track. So, I see I'm really down. I see that I'm very cynical. I see I'm being very judgmental. I see that instead of just pushing that farther, get curious. What might be off in my thinking? What might be off in my lifestyle? So Rabban Gamliel says that you must be actively involved in both. All Torah study without work will result in waste and will cause sinfulness. So here, Julie, go down if you can on the page. So here he's saying, Torah study without an occupation will in the end fail and lead to sin. So on one end, on the simplest level, what that means is if a person only studies Torah and doesn't work and relies on the community to support him and is in a position of begging or a position of requiring assistance from the outside, in the end, it's going to lead to the sin of what we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, which is Chilul Hashem, which is that the community might look at him in a degrading way, that they might form opinions about the Torah and about the Torah life based on his degradation. So on one level, on the simplest level, is don't get to a place where you're so needy and you rely so much on others that it creates an image that will extend beyond you and give an image of the Torah that of degradation, which is tough to hear. But I think also what's really interesting about this is the Torah is clearly saying that human beings need to make their own money in order to have essential basic self-esteem. That even though we always provide for the indigent and we always provide for the poor, and there's always been a welfare system in Jewish life, at the end of the day, the human being feels depressed when they're not the generator of their own success and they're reliant on other people. So it's something to think about in terms of we need to provide for people, but at the end of the day, we need to remember that ultimately it doesn't make them feel good. It's a little bit of a catch-22, which is probably the reason why that the highest level of tzedakah, or one of the two highest levels of tzedakah, is to give somebody a job, is to help them get a job. It is a much higher level of tzedakah to help somebody get a job than it is to help them financially. It seems like it's a one-dimensional sort of ethical teaching, but really on the deepest level, it goes back to I'm created with so much potential to, just like God is master of the universe, so too, even though I'm never master of my universe, God is master of my universe. I need to feel ownership of my universe. I need to feel a sense of command over my universe. And when I am reliant on other people, I don't feel that way. And that might be why, sometimes people will say, I've done so much for her. I've done so much for her. And she doesn't even say thank you. She never says thank you. Well, it might be that she's not an ingrate. It might be that you're rubbing against the deepest, most primal need to not be reliant on other people. And it's something to think about because how great is tzedakah, but it's also cutting into a very deep human need to not be reliant on other people. So that might have something to do with this concept that Torah study, which doesn't provide income, without an income, will in the end fail and lead to sin. But back to the idea of working and pursuing a livelihood, that it is not contradictory or parallel to learning Torah. That even the concept of the tefillin shel yad, of the arm and the tefillin shel rosh, they're bound together. They're bound together as one in the back of the tefillin, which really signifies to us that we have the opportunity to infuse both with each other. And this is very important, that however you work in the world, in the form of voluntary work, in the form of paid work, the idea that you're always working for the Almighty. You're in everything you do, in everything you say, in every choice that you make, you never, ever detach it from what does God want from me in this moment now. And that really is the idea that work and life are absolutely not separate in any way, that a person is always in relationship to their creator in their work life. So that the idea that choosing what to say, how to say it, choosing to lift people up or bring them down, choosing to be totally honest or thinking nobody's looking. That's one of the things we do tshuva for on Yom Kippur is, I've said this before, but we all do this, which is, okay, if nobody's looking, I'm alone, right? I'm alone, but we're never alone. And in everything that we do, it's, would God be comfortable in this decision? So the idea that your spirituality and your work should ever be separate from each other, God forbid, they're one and the same. But here's the deal. When we are at work, when we are engaged in spirituality, praying, learning Torah, people will often think about their work. They will often, right in the middle of the Shemona Esrei, a lot of people joke, I think David jokes too, that some of their best ideas about their work come when they're davening the Shemona Esrei, come when they're in the middle of prayer. Because the truth is, we are primarily focused on our external success and often don't prioritize our internal, although I don't think this group is necessarily like that. So Rabbi Bunam, who wrote Ethics from Sinai, he says, just like when you're in prayer and you're thinking about work, right? Immediately you're thinking about work. I love this quote because it's so dated. This is written in the 50s, the early 50s. He wrote his classic work on Pirkei Avot in the 50s. Often when we stand immersed in prayer, do we not permit a stray thought about business to enter our minds? Perhaps why a customer who should have arrived already from Atlantic City has not telephoned as of yet. I love that. Well, if you can recite your prayers and think of business, why can't you do business and think of a little Torah? So it's also a reminder to us that this is an olam hafuch, that this world is upside down. And the things that most people put a huge emphasis on will have no bearing in the larger picture of our lives in this world and the next. And the things that we don't focus on very often are the things that have the greatest importance. So we have to remember that when Rabban Gamliel writes this, he's writing it to people who are Torah studiers. And he says, Torah studiers, you must also work. But now in our world, this Mishnah means something very different, which is, yes, you must work. Yes, you must support yourself and your family like a mensch, and you must contribute, but it's not your whole identity. So what Rabban Gamliel was orienting it toward, it was a given that people were totally immersed in Torah. Make sure you work too. Now the message is, please don't identify too much with your work. If you're going to identify with your work, then it's not the title. It's not the praise. It's not the kavod. It's not the honor. Let what you identify with be the attribute. So if a person is an immigration lawyer, right? If a person's a lawyer, then it's not about identifying with I'm a lawyer. It's identifying with when I practice immigration law with the attitude that I'm helping people, that I'm making a difference. That's what I'm identifying with. But we say, we always say, like, who are you? Oh, I'm a teacher. I'm a lawyer. I'm a this. I'm a that. I'm a politician. And Judaism says, no, you are a human being. You're a Jew, and you work as a politician. So that it's ironic because what Rabban Gamliel was talking about, this Mishnah means something very, very different in our age, which is really not to get caught up in the things of little import in this world, and not to get confused in this world with the wrong values. That would be the equivalent of pouring tons and tons of pebbles and rocks in your jar and not being able to put the big, big rocks in. But if you put the big, big rocks in, then there's room for the little pebbles and the sand. So the big, big rocks are, you are a spiritual being having a physical experience. Not, I'm a physical being having a spiritual experience. A physical being having a spiritual experience means life is about getting ahead. And if I can throw in a little spiritual stuff, fantastic. But if you recognize that you really, truly, in essence, are a spiritual being having a physical experience, what that means is, at the end of the day, we're all souls. We're all neshamas in relationship to God. And how do we manifest that? Largely through the physical world. But there is no physical world without relationship with Hashem built into it. So it really just is a tremendous reminder of what's important. But they're going down here. It really is important to understand. And this is very, very interesting. I see this in Jerusalem all the time. There's a lot of poverty. There's really a lot of poverty. And Israel is unbelievably expensive. And just having a family of, a lot of people have large families, keeping it all going financially is extremely intense. And Pirkei Avot says in the 3rd chapter, Ein kemach, ein Torah. That means if there's no flour, if there's no sustenance, you really can't focus on your spirituality. This is really like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If your survival needs are not being met, there really isn't room for spirituality. And in your life, you're just focused on basic survival. Ein kemach, ein Torah. But it's also true, if there's no Torah, there's no flour. Now that's a really interesting point. Ein Torah, ein kemach. What does that mean? Person can have to be super, super rich. It doesn't mean, if they don't have Torah, it doesn't mean that they don't have all that stuff. So I think the second part of this line at the bottom really means is, if there's no raison d'etre for your stuff, if there's no overriding purpose for physical things, then what pleasure is there in physical things? They come and they go, and you get what you finally want, and it doesn't make you happy. You just move the goalpost forward. Now you got the house, now you have to furnish the house. You furnish the house, now you want to refurnish the house. You get it just moves farther, and there's no real pleasure, almost like a body of water that has no flow, that the river, that there's no current that flows through it. It's almost like it sits and it's not healthy. So if there's no flower, there's no Torah. That means if you don't have your physical survival needs met, you cannot think about God and spirituality. You can't think about deeper things. That's Maslow's hierarchy. But if there's no Torah, there's no flower. If you just have physical stuff for the sake of physical stuff, and you don't elevate it with, I have so I can bring joy to other people, so that I can bring meaning to other people, so I can help other people be comfortable, so I can share, so I can learn, so I can create a special like space for other people to get their needs met in my home, whatever it is. If there's no overriding raison d'etre for stuff, there really is no stuff. Because what is stuff? Stuff just fills up and just doesn't fill the void. So Julie, go down to the go down a little bit, please. Okay, so here we have 1 second. I think we dealt with this. Okay, I want to speak again, and then we'll open it up to the group. So it says very clearly here that Torah study without an obligation, without an occupation, will in the end fail sin. Without being involved in both leads to sin. So I think that I really think that we can all think about this. On one end, the Talmud says, if you're not constantly thinking about Torah, you don't really stand a chance in terms of standing up to desire and to your agenda, to your desires. But I think on a deeper level, we all require like almost like a nucleus, like a stabilizing center of purpose, a nucleus of meaning, a magnetic center of this is why I was created. And in its void, yucky stuff comes in. We learn this in the book of Genesis, in Bereshis, when the brothers throw Yosef into a pit. They actually throw their brother Yosef into a pit. And it says something so weird. I think I don't have my chumash up here, but it says the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Okay, that's superfluous. If the pit was empty, we know there was no water in it. And so that's like, and why does it say it 2 times? Empty, no water. And Rashi comments on it based on the Talmud. He says there was no water in it, but there were snakes and scorpions. Oh, here it's in Shabbat. Water there was not in it, but there were snakes and scorpions. In other words, the reason the Torah says there was no water in it means that there was something else in it. And here's the idea again. I said it already, but I think it's worth saying again. When a pit is empty, it fills up with the least desirable of nature's creatures in this case. Here's the point of this. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the best way for us to live our best lives is to fill it up with directed and purposeful behavior. That if it's empty, then all sorts of snakes and scorpions come to fill the void. But in the case of Yosef, they were actually snakes and scorpions. But in the case of us, it's the snakes and scorpions of familiar feelings of depression or anxiety or all sorts of things. So if, again, using your feelings as a guide, if you're feeling those things, it's very easy just to give into that, but to kind of shift a little bit to curiosity and say, Why might I be feeling these things? Could it be that my pit is empty and it fills up with serpents, and this is my serpent, and I need to fill the pit? By the way, this is true in so many ways that Gary Chapman, who wrote the great book, the 5 Love Languages, he writes about empty tanks that he says we all have inside of us. He calls it a love tank. He actually learned it from Dr. Ross Greene, who wrote the great book, The Explosive Child. 2 really, really amazing thinkers. And Gary Chapman says, we all walk around with a tank. When the tank is empty, we act out in all sorts of ways. We act out, we're passive aggressive, we're aggressive, we withdraw, we pout, we yell, we nag. But ultimately, all that stuff is coming from the fact that we're really on empty. So this concept of emptiness gets filled up with things that ultimately are very damaging for us. So it is when the snakes and scorpions come, it really is, or the acting out, or the whatever, in Gary Chapman's case, the real question is, what do I need to fill the tank? What might I need to do differently with my time, or whatever it is? Okay, I'm going to say one more thing, and then I want to open it up. The very last things are very important. Okay, okay, so here we have all who work for the community. They should do so for the sake of heaven. Okay, there's a lot to say about that. Community is the word for community in Hebrew is tzibur. Tzibur, like maybe you've heard of the word tefillah. Tzibur. Tzibur means community. It's actually made up of 3 letters: Sadi, Bet, and Resh. And those 3 letters stand for 3 things. Sadi means the tzaddik, the righteous one. Benoni is the regular person, us, right? And Resh is for Rishoyim, the wicked people. But the point is that there's going to be all sorts of people in this community, all sorts of people. And the only way we can work with community, which is filled with all sorts of people, is to do it for the right reasons. If we're doing it for our glory, then it will ultimately fall apart. But if we're doing it truly l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, to bring the world closer to its tikkun, to bring the world closer to God, then those are the people who can truly work for the community, who are doing it for the right reasons, not for their own aggrandizement. And I think I need to say one more thing. And okay, so just one more thing that I think is important, going back to Kol Torah she'ein ima malacha sofa betela gorer avon. And I just want to say this one more time. Really, to work is really divine. The word that they use for work is not avodah, which is what we would normally say for work, but is malacha. So malacha, we know from Shabbat, those are the things that we don't do on Shabbat are the 39 malachot, the 39 acts of creative labor. Those are the things that we don't engage in on Shabbat. They were the 39 acts of creative labor that went into working on the Mishkan. Bye, Linda. But what's important for us to understand is that we have a primal need to manifest creativity and autonomy. What does that mean? The reason we don't like relying on other people, which is why it's really saying you have to have a job. Rabban Gamliel is saying you have to have a job. You can't rely on other people. It's because just like God is autonomous, he acts alone, we too crave on a primal level our autonomy. And just like God is the ultimate creator of worlds, we also yearn to be creative in all different sorts of ways. It doesn't have to be you're an amazing artist. It could be you're creative with your words. It could be you're creative with your kindness. It could be you're creative with Shabbat. It could be you're creative in your work life. But the concept is these are 2 primal needs. If you don't engage in them, or if you don't pursue them, the end result is an emptiness. And we all know that in an empty space comes snakes and scorpions. But on a positive level, know that the good feelings we experience are because we're acting in ways that resemble God, creative and autonomous. We yearn for it. We're driven to make our mark on society. So there is no difference. They're absolutely combined. Spirituality and work. Work is spiritual. But when we engage actively in both of them, we fill the pit. We fill the tank. And when we don't, snakes and scorpions arise in its wake. So it's something to understand. And if you feel the snakes and scorpions in the form of all sorts of different things, acting out or feeling difficult feelings, remembering that curiosity, what might I not be tapping into in terms of being created in the image of God? I was created in the image of God, which means that I yearn to be like God, autonomous, creative, giving, so powerful. And when I'm not, I'll feel it. And the feelings are a GPS. God gave me those feelings so that I will recognize them and seek to fill the void. And thank God I have feelings that reorient me toward my power and creativity being created in the image of God. If I weren't given those feelings, it would be the equivalent of not feeling fire when you put your hand over the stove, right? God forbid you didn't feel pain. There are people that don't feel pain. If you didn't feel your pain, then you wouldn't pull your hand from the fire. That's feelings. Feelings are the same thing. They remind us, what might I be, where might I be off track? So I want to open it up and hear what anyone has to say about this Mishnah or anything at all. Adrian, are you, oh, I thought you were unmuting yourself, Adrian. No? Stephen, are you unmuting yourself? No?
I'm not, but I can.
Oh, hi there.
Hi. I mean, I don't really have much to say other than this is just so basic, isn't it? I mean, we all know that we have a need for meaningful engagement in our lives, in our world, and the lives of people around us. And without that, we feel a lack, we feel empty. I think we all know this at a very intuitive gut level, don't you think? It's very basic.
Yeah. It's basic. But one thing that I think isn't super basic is that it's actually an incredible gift that when we're not headed in the right direction, we'll feel certain things. And those feelings are there designed to help us like recalibrate. Just like the hand will pull itself away from the fire, so too, when we feel that sense of not being godly in our behavior, we'll feel the lack, and that we're meant to feel the lack. The lack is designed to teach us, okay, I need to reorient. There's something I need to shift in my life. And that I think you're right. It's super basic, but I think that is an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think so too. And not everybody though has the tools without the help of an expert coach to be able to.
Thanks. There's my marketing. There's my small business consultant giving me free advertisement. By the way, well, I'll return the favor. If anyone's ever starting a small business, this is your man.
No, I had a friend who once said, understanding is the booby prize, which I think is true. I mean, we can feel our feelings. We can even understand that we're not heading in the right direction, but that in itself does not fill our tool chest. It doesn't give us the things that we need to be able to make the changes to set our course back right. So I do think that we do need help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's why we need a friend, a teacher,
Right.
and a life coach.
Hi, Susie.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I think this group may find that it's basic because they're plugged in, but I think most Jews that I know, I mean, there needs to be both. There needs to be creative work, but there also needs to be Torah. And I think there are many Jews, more Jews than not, that are not studying. And so that balance, that you need both, you're going to be empty without one, but you're also going to be empty without the other. And that meaningfulness is critical to, and connectedness is critical to a full life. And so people don't realize even that they're missing it. But Pirkei Avot is telling us, yes, they are.
That's right. Ein kemach, ein Torah. If you're destitute, you can't think spiritually. But ein Torah, ein kemach, you can have all the stuff in the world. But if you don't have a spiritual worldview, if you don't have spiritual commitments, if you don't have an overriding understanding of life and the purpose of life, then all the physical stuff in the world can't fill the void.
Well, I think it sometimes seems that those who have the most are those who somehow are those who are the most out of balance and most out of touch.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which would make sense if we're thinking about this Mishnah. It would be very understandable. Hi, Len.
Hi, Rabbanit. Maybe the elephant in the room, there's a segment of the Jewish community, particularly in Israel, but not exclusively, that don't take this as obvious, that they spend their lives in Torah study and have to be supported by the state of Israel or the community. So they just don't see that this is applicable.
Well, I think okay. So Len is really addressing like what he calls the elephant in the room, which is interesting. So there's a large segment of the, lack of a better word, we'll use the word ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population that's exclusively in Torah. Couple things about that. A lot of them are working in a Torah context as teachers and as whatever. But the bottom line is not, I think that there is a growing recognition in that community that the system of dependency on external donations is non-sustainable. It's not just non-sustainable economically. It's not just a non-sustainable economic model, but it's also not healthy for human beings. Two things are going on. One is it's not healthy for them in terms of their sense of self, in terms of their self-esteem, to not be providing for their families. That's non-sustainable. It also sometimes creates what we talked about before, which is a Chilul Hashem, which is to be dependent, to be degraded. It doesn't make the Torah look desirable. It's what we call a Chilul Hashem. But Len, my feeling is a lot of people in that community are in fact working within the community. They're teaching and they're giving back in very meaningful ways. But I think your point is true. I think that anyone who's reduced to poverty and dependency on government and outside sources, I don't think it's going to last. I think it's crumbling. I think it's really imploding. It's imploding.
So I do agree with you. I would just say when the comment was made that it's obvious, it's not obvious to that group. It's becoming more important.
What did I say? Obvious?
No. I think it was Steve that said it, that this lesson was obvious, but there's a segment of, again, for lack of a better word, the ultra-Orthodox community that I would say didn't see this as obvious. it's coming to them now, and maybe it's being forced, or maybe it's an awakening that this Mishnah is something that needs to be taken seriously, or we wouldn't see this. We would see all of Torah's students working part-time in an obvious way, and recognizing they needed to support themselves and not depend on the state. So a lot of them
do. And Len, the truth is, I mean, I'm not being idealistic and whatever. The younger generation doesn't want to live in poverty. I see it because the 20-year-olds don't think like the 50-year-olds. They the previous generation, me and older, they are willing to live like in a more ascetic lifestyle in that world, but the younger generation doesn't want it. So you're even seeing in the Haredi world, there's a ton more movement into vocational training, and it's definitely shifting, at least in a lot of circles, to working more, because it's for sure not economically sustainable, but it's really also not sustainable psychologically. It's just not sustainable. The idea, Len, that there's a cadre of scholars who learn L'Shem Shamayim for the sake of heaven, that they learn all the time. The idea that there is, I don't want to use the word elite, but there is like a cadre of serious Torah scholars that are holding up the world with Torah study. I think that's universally accepted as not only legitimate, but essential. That there should be a cadre of scholars who are devoted purely to scholarship, because they're of the very fundamental idea that Torah study holds up the world. But for the masses, it's just, I agree with you. And I think they're also coming to agree that it's not sustainable, not just economically, but it's not creating happy, sustainable family systems for men to not be making some money and supporting their family. So I don't disagree with you.
I agree.
Anyone else? All right, guys. So wishing all of you a very happy Purim. I hope you come to L'Chaim Center. And Trudy, I'll see you soon if you're there.
I am here. I've been listening the whole time. I will see you soon. You'll have to WhatsApp. You have to give me details of what time you want me and where.
I will. I'll send it.
I will see you soon, and looking forward to seeing Alan
Safe
and
travels.
everybody.
Safe travels.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Julie, are you still there?
I am.
Can I give you a call? I have a question for you. Can I give you a call?
Yeah, of course. Or let me turn off the recording, which is what I was going to do. And you could just ask me.